Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eric Eisenman, a partner in Husch Blackwell's Milwaukee office and chair of our Labor and Employment Practice Group. Before we begin our presentation today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple applications for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit those via the question box. We will try to answer questions during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we'll make sure that we answer those questions later via email. A PDF of the presentation that we're going to share with you today is available in the Program Materials folder there at the bottom of your screen. This program has been approved for legal education hours. In order to report your hours, you can click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including the course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Towards the end of the program, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That's it for the housekeeping needs. So let's get started with our program. Today, we're going to be discussing ESG with a focus on the S, social considerations. We'll identify changes that your company can make to meet your ESG goals, to recruit and retain talented employees, and to flourish in a business marketplace where ESG continues to increase in importance. Joining me today are Caitlin Doyle and Larissa Whittingham. Larissa is a senior associate in our Springfield, Missouri office. She practices labor and employment law in our technology, manufacturing, and transportation business unit. Caitlin is a labor and employment associate in our Milwaukee office. She's deeply interested in ESG and has a bachelor's degree in environmental science and policy. And actually, Larissa and Caitlin are the ones who are most passionate about this. It's been a real pleasure for me to work with them in pulling together this presentation today. And I'm excited to share with you the information we've pulled together. I will get us started with just a little bit of an overview. So as I mentioned, we'll do an overview. We'll talk about some common goals and envisioning ideals as it relates to the social considerations in the ESG framework. We'll talk about ways that you can start small or concrete things that you can do as a business to begin to move the needle that might make a difference when you're reporting ESG related information for purposes of bidding contracts, communicating with shareholders, recruiting and retaining employees, all that stuff. And then talk also about some ideas that we can help you celebrate the good. Talk about ways that you can highlight the work that you've done and the success that you've already had in the ESG space so you can maximize your return on investment for the work that you're doing in ESG. So first, just an overview. Most of you who are joining us today already have, probably a basic understanding of ESG, but we'll cover that just briefly here for the group. ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance considerations that investors, employees, and other stakeholders can use to assess and evaluate whether a company is acting as a responsible corporate citizen. Now, I'll use the word responsible there. Exactly what responsible means will be different, depending on the context and who's asking the question. But generally speaking, the recent explosion of interest in ESG reflects an awareness that investors and stakeholders are holding companies to a higher standard than they have in the past and expect more than simply a short-term financial return. Consideration of some of these factors have now become a norm in the investment community. Historically, we've observed investors and the general public applying some sort of screen or tax on corporations involved in businesses like tobacco or arms dealing. But what this ESG framework does, we believe, is it allows interested parties to effectively score a company on a range of factors, from carbon emissions to workplace safety, to the gender balance on a board of directors. A favorable ESG score can help attract investment, attract employees, and to improve a company's reputation in the marketplace. So our presentation today is going to focus, as I said, on the S in ESG, social considerations. But just a word on the other two. E stands for environmental and is used to assess a company's impact on the planet. This includes energy use, waste disposal, raw material sourcing, water usage, recycling processes, and carbon emissions, a big one that you hear a lot right now. The G is governance, how a company is directed and controlled, including the composition of its board and the manner at which it interacts with its shareholders. Our colleague, Craig Adur, one of the leaders of Husch Blackwell's ESG team, has authored a terrific white paper on diversity of public company boards of directors. That's available on our ESG page of the Husch Blackwell website. I believe either Larissa or Caitlin will be directing that for you later. I'd encourage you to check that out. I would also say that there's a fair amount of overlap, in particular between the S and the G, the social and the governance. You'll hear us talk a lot today about diversity, about equity, about balance, and those are concepts that show up very heavily in both of those categories. Before we get into the weeds of S, however, I'm going to turn it over to Larissa, who will speak a bit about who the key stakeholders are in the ESG analysis and what sort of metrics are currently being used to establish an ESG score. But before that, we have a poll question. The question is, has your company started strategizing or implementing policies to reach your ESG goals? Please feel free to take a look and click your answer. We'll be populating those on our end, and when I advance the slide, you'll be able to see what the groups here are looking at. This might be a nice, helpful benchmarking tool for us to kind of see with the group that we've got today. Looks like about half of us are strategizing and implementing. Some have started strategizing and about a quarter have not yet begun. That makes sense. That's consistent with, I think, what we're seeing. Thanks for sharing that information. If you started strategizing and implementing, how has that been going? One more poll here. Have you guys click in? Looks like we may not have had any responses in the time that I said there, but we're going to be collecting that data, be sharing that with you after our presentation. So, Larissa, take it away and give us an overview.
Hello, everyone. It's a delight to be with you today. This is one of my favorite topics, talking about ESG, which has become quite a catchphrase, but it's something that I think most of the people on this presentation were probably already thinking of without using those terms even before becoming involved in the ESG universe to whatever extent you are in your business. So happy to be with you. Look forward to whatever questions or comments you have in the chat. So you don't have to be in the ESG universe very long to see the term ESG stakeholders. So this is a concept that discusses who really is demanding, who's requesting, who's seeking ESG goals and implementation. So this is not just investors. I think this was one of the primary beginnings of the ESG stage, was looking at, from an investment perspective, what are companies doing? But it's not just investors, not either public or private, but you're looking at customers. So either the direct consumer of your product or your service, or if you're in the business to business space, businesses of whatever size who are determining whether to give you the opportunity to serve them. Employees is something that I think most of you on this call will be able to relate to right now, as this labor market has really shown a different balance of power for a lot of employees who didn't realize the leverage that they could have in deciding where they wanted to end up. And more employees are considering ESG type factors and determining where they want to spend their career long term. And Caitlin's going to discuss that a little bit more, but something that you'll hear and you'll see across the states right now and beyond the United States for sure. So another stakeholder is the communities in which you work. Geographically, you can see this as new businesses enter the marketplace, that there's no longer just a focus on the laws. Say a new manufacturing facility entering a city, you're not just looking at the ability to comply with local ordinances. You're looking at community activists who are examining the record of your say, workplace safety measures, or what press you received from employees or consumers or other partners in your business before they enter that market. So communities and employees, I think, play a very interesting double role in the ESG world. And by that, I mean they function as a stakeholder, someone who's demanding ESG action to come and to work in your workplace or to accept you into the community, but also as a beneficiary. So many of the S goals that we're going to talk about today are focused on employees, not all, but quite a few, and what you can be doing to serve your employees more holistically. The same thing with communities. You'll see many businesses offering opportunities such as paid time off for employees to volunteer in their community, or other investments in their space that allow them to be both a beneficiary and a stakeholder in the concepts we will talk about today. Suppliers, vendors, and partners. It's interesting how these groups can be a double role as well in another way. One thing we'll talk about later in this presentation is a supply chain ESG goal. And one of the ways that you can implement some ESG measures around that could be providing questionnaires or other checklists for your vendors. But then you also see vendors providing it to the people they're working with, questionnaires to make sure that they are committed to the same ESG principles. So those relationships can go both ways.
One of the things that I like, Larissa, that you've set up here when you're identifying the different stakeholders is, you know, this clearly applies not just to big publicly traded companies, but these, what I think your list makes clear is that there are stakeholders that are relevant for businesses of all size. All businesses are going to be dealing with employees and customers and the communities that they're in. So I think it's helpful to frame why this is relevant to really all of our different clients.
Absolutely. I think that's been a very fascinating part to me of getting deep in the weeds of this ESG world, is that, you know, what began as a focus in the publicly traded world has really spread to, you know, any kind of industry, any kind of geography or size of business. It's just that consumers care about it, employees care about it, investors care about it. So there's not really a way to avoid, even if you don't use the term ESG, you know, the type of issues that we're talking about today. So a question I often get when I'm talking to someone new about ESG is, well, how do you know if you're meeting the standard? How do you know if you're doing the right thing? And this is a very complicated question because there's no one centralized list even of issues, which we'll talk about pretty soon, but even within an issue, you know, how do you know if you're meeting the mark? Like Eric mentioned earlier, how do you know whether you are being responsible, quote unquote, in that industry or in that topic? So there is a large amount of agencies and businesses, some for-profit, some nonprofit, who have developed standards and ratings and benchmarks and frameworks. You'll see all of these terms. That could be its own series of webinars, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but we wanted you to be aware that they're out there and that it's something that can help us identify the common issues that we'll talk about soon. So PRI is Principles of Responsible Investing, and that really looks at it from the investor framework of what are you going to prioritize in investment decisions. Many companies will look at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. In the standards, there's GRI is a common one. I'll have a sample of that here in a moment. SASB you'll see as well. This is a rapidly changing field. Just last year, the agency who developed the SASB standards, which I'm going to make sure that I get all my acronyms correct here, it was governed by the Value Reporting Foundation. They were coordinating with Climate Disclosure Standards Board to create the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. How's that for another acronym? So all of these areas are ones that you may already be familiar with if your company has decided that you're going to commit to maintaining one of these standards, or it may be something that you look to say, okay, well, maybe here's an idea of the data I need to collect. And Eric, we'll go on to the next slide, and you'll be able to see just a clip of a GRI standard. This is from their employment set. You can go to the website that I have listed there, globalreporting.org, and see those yourself. This is just, you know, a clip of one page from the employment one discussing parental leave. I think it's helpful for companies to take a look at these businesses, organizations, and we've got education clients on here, no matter where you're at, to see the kind of things that reporting agencies or standards agencies are going to be looking at. You can see under the requirements that it's not just a check a box, do you have a parental leave policy, or tell me how long your parental leave policy is, which may be the first step is how long is your paid leave, but it's also looking at retention. So, C&D, what's the total number of employees that return to work the reporting period after leave or 12 months after? And so really taking a much broader approach to this one sub issue of parental leave than you might immediately think. So as you're developing what your particular goals are in the S world of the ESG universe, doing a check on those issues before implementing some new policies are helpful to figure out what data to collect. Looking at the retention from when someone gets back from leave, maybe not something that you would immediately think of, but that you want to do in case you are ever reporting on GRI standards or just want to have that data to share later.
This is one of the more confounding pieces of this ESG space, and especially for lawyers like us who are trained to make sure we have a good understanding of what the law is and the regulations, and to use that to guide us on how we advise our clients. But I suspect that many of you who have been sort of working in this space already sometimes feel a sense of frustration, which is, okay, well, I want to make progress in each of these areas, but what standards should I be using? What rules should I be using? And I think what Larissa's shown here is that there's a number of different frameworks. There hasn't been sort of a universal consensus about which of these to use. I think we've pointed you guys in the direction of some of them that we find helpful, and those are areas that we're happy to sort of talk with on an individual basis as well. But I think my takeaway for you here is simply, to the extent that you're watching this presentation and you have internal stakeholders who are saying, okay, what's the test here? What are the rules that we're supposed to follow? It's fine if your answer is it's not really clear. We have some guidance here, but there's a lot of moving targets. So the understanding is that you can pick and choose, or there's going to be different rules that may apply, but there are some overarching principles that are consistent. And I think that's probably where you're going next, Larissa.
That's right. And then looking at those overarching principles that show up over and over again when you're looking at standards or frameworks or benchmarks, or even just looking at how the press is portraying ESG, you can see, well, here's some issues that come up frequently in the S space. Like Eric discussed, there's a lot of overlap for some of these. So you can see at the top of our list, we have diversity, equity, inclusion. That's absolutely an S goal. It's something that is going to affect employees. It's also going to affect the board, composition of the board, and the governance, the G factor. So there's overlap. It's not a perfect science, but as you pursue goals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course, that is going to be helpful to your company in many ways. And it's not necessary to box it into any of these, S or the G either. So you can go down the list with different examples. One thing I think it's important for you to think about, and I think many of you have already gone through this, and so many, such a high percentage are already implementing some level of ESG goals, is that you don't have to make a ESG goal checklist for every single sub issue within S, within E, and within G. That's too much, and no one has the capacity to meet each and every one of those. So figuring out what is a priority for your business, for your organization, and focusing in on however many of those it's realistic to do. So for instance, in anti-harassment, that's something that everyone here is going to have a base level, right? You're going to have your anti-harassment policy. You're going to have a process for reporting, something that guarantees compliance. I like to use the term compliance plus with ESG. It's you've got that bare minimum, and then what else above? So maybe anti-harassment isn't the particular part of S that you are focusing on. You still have anti-harassment protocols and policies in place, but you're choosing on spending the resources and personnel in the ESG front on something a little different. So, another one I wanted to highlight here is the data privacy. So I think this has been a little bit of an evolving topic of whether does this fit within ESG. It's clear now that it does to some effect because of how much it affects the stakeholders in the ESG world, whether you're looking at consumer data privacy or employee data privacy. And this is another example how you're always going to have a level of compliance that applies and that you're going to be spending time on, regardless of whether you're looking at that plus a factor to put this on your ESG radar.
I really like the way that you frame that, Larissa, and I think that is a good way to think about it, right? I mean, these are all categories where, or most of these categories at least, there are specific rules, laws that an employer is following. Labor rights, you know, I'm not interfering with my employees' rights under the Labor Relation Act, or I'm paying the minimum wage. You know, like Larissa said, the concept here is often compliance plus. What are those areas where you're going above and beyond what may be legally required? And those are the sort of factors that end up getting scored and graded from an ESG framework. Should we move on to the next poll question, Larissa?
Yes, that'd be great.
Great. I'll try to leave this up for a little bit longer. We got a couple comments in. We presenters are looking at one version of this screen, so we may not see exactly what you're seeing there, but we believe that the question here should be at the bottom of your screen, the place to be able to enter information. So the question here is, what barriers is your company facing in ESG strategy or implementation? Resistance from an executive team, budget, I just don't know where to start, time, or other. Great, appreciate that. Got folks who were able to find that this time. Looks like time. That's a big one. You know, the world sort of seems like it's always on fire these days, and I can imagine that this is an area where it can be difficult to prioritize. But it seems like a substantial majority of folks just struggle with that as well. So maybe what we can do is hopefully help identify some areas, some low-hanging fruits, to use the phrase that we used in the overview, of ways that you can make a difference to improve your performance in these areas. So next, we're going to turn it over to Caitlin to talk about you know, maybe the downsides to not prioritizing ESG.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I'm really excited to see that so many of our audience members are, you know, taking the time to actually be implementing and strategizing ESG. That's absolutely imperative in this era, in this day and age. And as Larissa and Eric said, following the law is kind of the minimum. So we're focusing on compliance plus. So on this slide, I have some news articles that I just, you know, purely screenshotted over the last 3 months, you know, with companies who are really struggling with this S piece. So we have this great resignation, as the media is calling it, which really significantly can impact your candidate pipeline, where candidates, especially younger people, millennials, Generation Zs, who are coming into the workforce, are really prioritizing, you know, their own well-being and their social impact in a employer, in a business. And so where these are not being met, where their needs are not being met, we're seeing a lot of people leaving, or, you know, turning to news outlets to kind of blast their employer on the struggles that they're facing internally. So regardless of if you get that really positive media press from implementing ESG, you're definitely going to get that negative press if you don't. And that could be really impactful on, you know, in getting employees or retaining employees, especially where this younger generation is really focused on, you know, those sort of community and social impacts that they want to have in a forever employer. So
go ahead, Caitlin. Is this the right slide?
Yes, perfect.
Great.
So in envisioning these ideals, these kind of bigger, what you should be striving for, generally on the left, we have general ideals that you should be kind of thinking about in your everyday structure. So you want to diversify your candidate pipeline. You want to try to get a supply chain that is socially conscious, provide transparency. Those 3 ideals we'll go into a little bit more depth with coming up. But you can also do things like creating community spaces. That could be, if you already have a lunch area, maybe encourage employees to take lunch at the same time. Prioritize mental and physical health. I know a lot of insurance companies right now are helping employers do that. So, you know, maybe turn to your insurance company and see if they'll subsidize a community garden, or if they'll, help you reduce the stigma around mental health and well-being, or, put together walks during lunch for employees to take, and encourage mentorship. Really strive to create bonds throughout all levels of your employment sectors so that people feel like they have a community at work, that they have people that they can turn to with that confidential bond, and can really, provide their worth to a company. I also saw that we have some industries here, so welcome, especially education. So on the right, we have some industry-specific ideals that you should really be implementing in your, kind of everyday life, like the bigger things you should be striving for, which could help with this time barrier. If you really focus on these ideals and try to get there through small steps, a domino effect will come, and you'll be able to really show some measurable growth and change over time. So healthcare, especially in the era of COVID and the era of essential employment, share your successes with the staff and allow them to celebrate with each other. Manufacturing, promote sustainability, especially in that supply chain, and really show your employees that you're valuing that. Construction, improve workplace safety. It's a big one. OSHA, like we said, compliance plus. So what else can you be doing to ensure your employees know that they're safe, that they're valued, and that their employer, will take immediate action to correct things that aren't necessarily, that they don't necessarily feel are safe. Real estate, you can integrate transportation alternatives. So maybe that means allowing or implementing bus routes, or, talking to the city to try to figure out what that means. Here in Milwaukee, we have the HOP. So maybe working on expanding that. Technology, really allow collaboration. Once again, that kind of goes back to mentorship, community spaces, really try to get and build these relationships so that you can grow and develop and retain this amazing talent that you have. Education, offer holistic well-being approaches. This is at all levels. For your employer, your employees, this could mean offering, benefits like a greater parental leave policy, or a greater stipend for independent research, or, what have you. But this also matters for your students in education. As Larissa mentioned at the beginning, your customers are a big part of ESG initiatives. So what are you doing to attract students or retain students in a world where we have a lot of education opportunities? What makes your education specific or unique or valuable for these students?
Caitlin, that's a good segue. We got a nice audience question in, and the question was, from your perspective then, is S in the ESG primarily internal facing? What is our obligation to bring the S to our customers? I don't know, Larissa or Caitlin, do you have a thought or response to that?
Yeah, so my initial response is that is an interesting worded question because of the obligation. And I think that you've really touched on, whoever has asked the question, touched on a good point there. Is there's not a lot of obligation on the S to do the outward facing, not nearly as much as the internal obligation, which has a lot to do with, whether it be state or local law or industry groups that your business may have committed to certain policies or I'll use the word standards again, guidepost. And I think most of those are more internal. However, you may want to go above the obligation to highlight different investments in the external in the community for a variety of reasons. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but I'll just to preview, there's a wide range of outside businesses who are providing like a reporting structure on companies. And you'll see this mostly with really large companies, but I would not be surprised to see an increase in local reporting of how well businesses are doing on these X factors. And you don't have to be publicly traded to still be subject to some of these, depending on who it is. And most of those groups are going to be looking at public data. So a lot of them aren't going to come to you and ask how you think you're doing, or if they do, it's going to be this cumbersome questionnaire that we'll talk about more later. But to get ahead of some of those, just to keep your business, your organization looking good in the press, to correspond to what you're actually doing when you're actually putting in these internal frameworks, you might consider having one or two things that are external, whether they're actual benefits for the community like volunteer, or just highlighting externally what you're doing internally, so that you can get the recognition you deserve for that investment.
That's helpful. And I agree with that. And I also think that if you were to contrast the E and the S in ESG, it's easier to see the way in which E, the environmental considerations, have a direct and quantifiable impact on the world and the community that the business operates in. And there are more, I think, of these S concepts that we're talking about today that are focused internally on the relationship between you and your employees, for instance. The only other thing I'll say, though, is I think one way that the S manifests itself outward looking is the emphasis on being a member of the community in which your business operates. So when we look at the employment piece of that, are the wages that you're paying employees sufficient that they're able to have a living wage in the community that they're in, that they're able to buy homes and to, be stakeholders in that community? Are we contributing, are identifying causes in those communities where you can partner as a business to support those? Those are, I think, some of the outward facing ways that S can be, touching stakeholders outside of the organization.
I also think it's important to note, in an ideal world, your internal developments on S would translate to external validation without you having to do anything. So if you treat your employees well, love, hate, Glassdoor, it's a place where employees can go to, kind of air their grievances or celebrate your successes. And so even if you're not doing anything externally, if you're doing, in an ideal world, right, if you're doing everything you can to make sure that S is there, your employees will kind of take care of that for you. And you should see that through your pipeline and through referrals to work at your company.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you for the question. We've got another poll question here for some benchmarking here. We talked about industry, and we'll be hitting on a couple other concepts that relate here, but we thought it might be helpful for the group to get a sense for the particular industry that you as a participant today are in. We've got our list of industries there, and I would encourage you again at the bottom of your screen to find that answer button and help us identify which industry you're working in. Larissa, while we're waiting for attendees, one of the other questions that we got in our inbox here was, are we aware of any governmental employers at the state or federal level using or looking into ESG? Are you aware of state or federal governments that are looking at that?
So I interpret that question two ways. So state and government agencies are looking into ESG factors from a regulatory perspective in some cases. The SEC is looking at some potential rules related more to the climate issues that they're not enacted yet, but it's pretty easy to find some resources, and we can link a Husch Blackwell blog on that, as well as, we'll talk about some other more targeted regulations that are certainly impact the ESG. In terms of whether employers from a governmental perspective are looking at ESG factors in their internal decision making, I have not seen it characterized in that way as frequently. So I think that there is certainly some implementation that's not called ESG, especially as you're looking at employee retention. And so you'll see a lot more of the focus, both in governmental and social services employers. This is the way that we are benefiting our communities. These are some of the additional benefits that you won't find at this, X for-profit job. And so I don't think it's being articulated in the same way, but you'll see a lot of the actual practice being implemented.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Here's our breakdown. Looks like we've got folks across the board, 20% manufacturing. We mentioned that we had a good amount of folks in education, healthcare. So maybe my takeaway from this slide is simply that these concepts are going to be relevant, as Larissa said, across the board, regardless of your industry or the size of your organization. So we thought we'd talk about ways that we can start small. We've used the phrase low-hanging fruit, but then we've also used the phrase ideals. I think of those as sort of on two ends of the spectrum. What are some things that you can do in one of these S spaces that can, easier to achieve, more concrete? But then how does that, and I think Caitlin used the phrase, how does that turn into a domino effect to begin to sort of make improvements for your business down the road? So one way, and we've talked about the concept of diversity a couple times, DE&I, what is sort of an initial step that I can take as a business to say, I want to start to improve, my ESG score as it results to the diversity in my organization. So a logical first step is to conduct a measurement of that diversity, right? If you aren't already, figure out the way to correctly capture that information that you may be getting from applications or EEO1 forms, and make sure you get your arms around or understand what the diversity numbers look like in your organization. Compare that maybe to the community that you're living in, right? You want, in a perfect world, diversity numbers in your company that mirror or match the diversity numbers in the area where you're operating. That's not always going to be the case. And depending on your industry, that may be difficult or outside of the norm, but a useful way to sort of begin to measure that. Once we have that sort of data in hand, think about ways that you can celebrate that. And we've got some specific content towards the end of our presentation about ways where you can sort of highlight or celebrate that. But use that information internally to train your own organization's executives on the importance of diversity, conduct implicit bias training if you're not already doing that, making sure that you're mentoring diverse employees. That was a concept that came up previously in a way where I think you can really move the needle in this space. Celebrate the diversity that your company already has. We're in Black History Month right now, a great time to be able to highlight the efforts that your organization has made and the contributions that diverse employees may have made in your company. And then ensure your company has sort of a clear promotion pathway for diverse candidates, looking for internal diverse talent that you're going to be able to fill those positions. So you measure it, find ways to emphasize and celebrate it. And then finally, the bigger sort of piece to bite off, but one that's critically important right now, think about ways that you can actually diversify that candidate pipeline. How do I get more diverse applicants and employees into my organization? It's true that it's extraordinarily difficult to sort of recruit lateral talent at the senior level who's diverse. A person who's in that position is incredibly in demand. So what most organizations are doing are trying to focus on ways that they can diversify that pipeline, ensure that you've got as many diverse candidates as possible who are coming into the screening process or organizational process. And again, that could be its own sort of separate topic or discussion, but that's a way in which you can take each of those steps in this space. At the bottom of the slide there, you see who needs to be involved in your business. We think in order to sort of make a progress in this area, you've got sort of an overlap of different aspects here. Human resources and marketing, compliance and legal, and the executive team all need to be aligned in order to make progress in this area. So that's one sort of decision tree here. Oh, go ahead, Larissa.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Eric and I wrote a blog post of like 5 simple ways that you can advance ESG goals in your business a few months ago. And one area that I thought was very compelling that we included there is that if you have a recruiting staff or one particular recruiter or a hiring manager that does frequent hiring, make sure that implicit bias training is a routine part of the training for those hiring individuals, because that is a simple, pretty cost-effective way to, from the very front end, to cut off that implicit bias that may be affecting your hiring without people's knowledge. It's something that data has shown to be effective. There's plenty of resources of people who can provide it for not incredibly expensive. So that's one example of low-hanging fruit that can go a long way if it's not already being done with the hiring professionals in your organization.
Terrific. Thanks, Larissa. Supply chain. Let's talk about this example.
So I am not a supply chain expert, but because this comes up so often in the S and ESG world, I've really dove in with some of our actual supply chain experts. I put Courtney O'Toole Morgan's name there. She leads the Husch Blackwell's International Trade and Supply Chain Group. She's been a fantastic resource. The firm also has former FBI investigators, compliance professionals, U.S. attorneys, people who run the gamut of understanding, like we mentioned, the compliance legal piece of some supply chain issues that companies can ride into with this plus of what can we do in addition to anything that we're required to. So on my far right of the little arrow there, I have an example ideal. And I want to be clear that that ideal is not necessarily the ideal for every business or organization, because some companies are going to be far too large to, what this says, trace each step of the supply chain and guarantee full human rights compliance. If you have lots and lots of vendors and suppliers, that may not be a feasible ideal, but it's a place to start to figure out where would be the goal for our organization. So looking from step one is, what is a simple small task that I can do to get me closer to whatever ideal I've chosen? And maybe you start with this big ideal, even if you know that plausibly this probably isn't going to happen, but I need to take steps in that direction to figure out how can I reach what's possible. And I found that companies and employers who start doing that, their perspectives change on that question of what's possible in both regards. Maybe they hear something and they think there's no way we can do this, and then they find out they have all these resources and they can, or the opposite, and think this is our goal, and you run into maybe some third party that's making a decision that you can't control to get to that ideal, and so you have to tweak it a little bit. So one simple step that a lot of companies and many of you on this call already may be implementing is providing a risk assessment questionnaire for suppliers, for vendors. This is something that, again, there's a lot of resources. Our supply chain group helps create these. There are many others out there to figure out what might be a red flag that you need to assess a supply relationship from day one when you're selecting vendors. So looking at where your product is coming from, or if you've got a service business that you're looking at certain service vendors, what questions can you use to weed out some potentially problematic issues? And then in the middle, you might be getting to a place where there's a couple of formative, very critical relationships that these are necessary to your final product, to your final services. And so it's worth the time to invest in knowing that particular supplier. So sometimes you might have an annual visit, an annual meeting with just these few suppliers that you know are critical. And so you may not be at the point of the final ideal of understanding the full complexity of the chain for everyone you're working with, but for these particular relationships, you're able to do that. So this is something that, again, multiple areas of the businesses may need to be involved. So your procurement needs to understand, what is recommended for this initial questionnaire. You may have legal looking at particular issues, say if your company is subject to the Transparency in Supply Chain Act in California. So you may already have some of these in, and you want to highlight and report on additional steps you're making. Or for international employees, the UK's Modern Slavery Act. You may already have some of these. And for those of you that aren't subject to that, you're able to capitalize on the resources available to those who are. So these are an example of ways that you can work backwards, envision the goal, what's a small step, and then in the middle, maybe figure out, here's where we're determining what's possible, what's not, and maybe focusing on those critical relationships.
Two anecdotes that came to mind for me as I was talking with Larissa about this one. First, the news that's front page for all of us, the things that are going on in Ukraine and Russia right now, to the extent that a business has relationships with Russia or businesses in Russia, how is that going to impact their ability on a going forward basis, either to continue that relationship from a business standpoint, or whether there is reputational damage or ESG damage as a result of continuing to do business there. That's a clear example, I think, that you could think about. And then the second one, way more anecdotal, but I like to ride motorcycles, and I was looking this weekend at Harley-Davidson website. They've got some beautiful new motorwear, some clothes, and there was this really cool denim jacket with Harley-Davidson stitched in the back, and I was taking a look at it. And on the website, it had all the details about the jacket, but then at the bottom it said responsibly manufactured in India. So I had never seen that before on a website. Them being very forward about, listen, we understand that if we simply say made in insert country, there might be legitimate concerns about the way in which that relationship or the labor that was used in that context. But that's an example of a business, not a particularly progressive company, at least as I think about it, but one who recognizes that's important enough for them to put on the website when they're advertising that product.
And that's an interesting point about how the departments within a company need to work together. Is you may already in your company have a list of things that you're reporting for purposes of those acts that I mentioned or some other law or regulation that your legal team puts together, but maybe they never make it to marketing. And so how can you talk about, okay, these are things we're already doing for whatever reason, let's highlight it so that the consumer on the webpage knows, oh yeah, we're already sourcing this responsibly. Let's make sure people are aware of it, whether it's the consumer or these reporting agencies.
Great. Caitlin, share one more example with us. Oh, you might be on mute, Caitlin.
Thanks, Eric. So as Eric and Larissa have already talked a lot about the overlap between, governance and this social aspect. But we also have to remember that environment it's a big overlap. And so, work smarter, not harder when it comes to ESG, and find ways that you can overlap your goals and combine goals when possible. So specifically in the environmental realm, the big distinguishing factor of companies who are excelling in this environmental area is that their mission is really specific and tied to what they want their ESG goals to be. So in terms of, refocusing that mission to figure out how you can promote your mission of your company to include the social and the environmental and the governance factors. Especially with, I like statistics. So I found a statistic that about 45% of the workforce right now is millennials and Generation Zs, but within the next 8 years, it's going to jump to about 75%. And these generations really do care about that environmental and social factor. And another statistic I found was that, currently 79% of millennials are loyal to companies that care about the E and the S factor specifically. So refocusing the mission, I said, was a small low-hanging fruit because it's very cost efficient. It takes little effort to, change a little bit in your employee handbook and to promote that internally to your employees. And if, you can get your employees involved in that, have your employees help you understand what they are looking for your company to do. This could be as simple as a suggestion box, but if you do a suggestion box, do read and respond to those suggestions. Do a survey, have town halls, really simple things that you can do to get your employees involved and make them feel as though they have a say in the direction of your company. The second is to, build a community around that mission. If you have employees involved in creating the mission, this is a pretty easy step to make. When employees have, a network within their employment, within their employer, it helps increase productivity, innovation, loyalty, kind of what we started talking about earlier, and, having those mentorship relationships or those community spaces, as simple as a lunchroom. Give all employees insights into how the company should progress, and that naturally will push your company to do better and to achieve their goals in measurable ways. And the last one is provide transparency. Now, bear with me, because a lot of employers hear transparency and they freak out a little bit, which I completely understand, and rightfully so. But this could be internal transparency. Start with, publishing salaries of your employees. Give your new employees a very clear path to promotion. What are the expectations of them? Provide feedback, allow them to see their growth within your company, and allow them to understand what their terminal employment wants to be, what they want to get to. Involve legal. That's a big one. And that kind of takes us into who needs to be involved. And if you do transparency, make sure you consult legal. You don't want to be accidentally publishing trade secrets or confidential information, or giving employees access to more than they should have access to. So that's a big factor, is make sure that you are providing transparency in ways that are meaningful, and still secure your company's work product. You also want to make sure you involve human resources and marketing to make sure that employees outside or potential employees outside know about all of these cool innovations that you're doing. and compliance, and the employees, that's the biggest one. And this overlaps with environment because, as I was saying earlier, the millennial and Generation Zs, if you're listening to the feedback they're providing, they're going to be pushing you into an environmental compliance plus sphere. They want to make sure that they are part of a workforce that is socially aware that they're being treated well as that's prioritizing the longevity of, our natural resources and our supply chains, and all of those ethical standards that come along with the environmental compliance portion.
Caitlin, your discussion of the legal, involving legal, is a nice segue to one of the audience questions that we had, which is who usually drives an ESG initiative? Is it legal, or does legal simply need to be evolved and aligned? Interested in your thoughts on it. My initial take is that it can be legal, but I think in many businesses, the ESG sort of initiative is being driven by stakeholders like investors, members of the board of directors, executive level leadership. And then, as Caitlin said, important to involve legal to ensure that those efforts are done in a way that comply with your internal rules or regulations. Thoughts on that, Larissa or Caitlin?
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations on this topic actually, because it varies so much from company to company or organization, business, depending on what industry you're in. And so a lot of times I've seen this come primarily from the executive team, or maybe there's board members saying, hey, I've been seeing all about this ESG. What are we doing about it? And so then the executive team figures out who they're going to ask. And again, depending on the size of the business you're working with, it trickles down. And so a lot of times I've seen ESG housed within compliance. Some businesses may have their own ESG team or an ESG either executive or professional that works with other teams. Legal certainly is involved. So one thing that you need to consider as you're developing an ESG strategy, whether you call it that for the businesses where it makes sense, or the question from the governmental sector is, do we call it that or just care about the things we care about, is developing a focused team, whether this is within a steering group, a committee, or however you want to call it, to focus on the ESG initiatives. So many pieces have to be involved, like we've illustrated in these examples, that you want to make sure that it's not siloed, where you miss out on important contributions and the accountability that Caitlin was talking about. But where it comes down to, or comes from, drives it, definitely varies based on the business you're talking to.
Caitlin, can you give us an example of a business that did this well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like statistics and I like case studies. So Walmart is actually a company that's done pretty well. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but these are screenshots that I've taken over the last 6 years. So from 2015, when they really had a struggle of retaining workers and paying them well, and to now, where they're even hosting ESG focused discussions on climate change. And to go back to the transparency that I was talking about in the last slide, Eric, if you want to go to the next slide. These are screenshots from their website, publicly accessible information. And these are, this was pages upon pages of information. And I've just highlighted here some of the things we're talking about. They have their culture, diversity, and inclusion reports posted that anyone can access. They have their ESG events that they're hosting. They're, promoting a new era of trust in Walmart. And to Larissa's point, they're showing their responsible supply chain. Now, if you actually look at this supply chain, the last thing that they have is from 2015. So are they doing this perfectly? No, absolutely not. But are they making an effort, a very intentional effort to allow people to see what they're up to? Absolutely. And I think this is a big pro of Walmart. Now, if you're not a national company, this might be a little bit harder for you to do, but I don't think it's impossible to put up a couple PDFs on your website and highlight what you're doing, what you're trying to do.
Terrific segue. Go ahead, Larissa.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It definitely connects back. I appreciate you mentioning the supply chain to that example. So there is a reporting agency called Know the Chain that is sponsored, for lack of a better word, like a partnership between several agencies. I don't want to misquote, so I wrote them down: Humanity United, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Sustainalytics, and a few more. And it reports on a variety of companies and their dedication to the supply chain. It was interesting on their website. There's like a frequently asked questions about, well, can companies opt out? And the answer is no. It's one of these reporting agencies where if they determine that you're at the market cap and they want to report on you, they go and they get publicly available information. And they may send out a questionnaire as well, but they're going to give you a score. And I knew Caitlin was going to use that Walmart example, so I looked them up. And as of when I looked them up, I think there were 18 of 36 in that category. So they just kind of fell on the halfway mark. That's fine. But it's such a great point about, they're going to get that score regardless of whether they publish this data or not. And so if you're doing it and if you're making some progress towards, you need to celebrate it, which again, we'll talk about. But I think that's a great example of getting out there. And maybe if they had some updated information, it would have been another number on the list. So again, not all companies are going to get that report on a know the chain or other data point, but you might get a local press release from a very eager student who's digging into ESG in their community.
And I want to go right there, Larissa. We only have a couple minutes left, but I want to have a chance for you to talk about ways for that businesses can highlight the success that they've had. This slide here is simply a reminder, as we talked about before, that this is something that a business of all sizes can do. There are elements on here about considering diversity in hiring, thinking about supply chain, measuring those efforts that a business literally of any size can do. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But let's get to ways in which you as an organization can highlight and celebrate the work that you're doing. Take it away, Larissa.
Right. Well, I'm not going to read all of these because we're short on time, so feel free to peruse. But I want to highlight what I think may be the most helpful to businesses and organization, and one of which is the ESG Historian. So most, if not all of you, are already doing things that would check a box on your goal list of things that you want to accomplish. So putting those in one place, having a person that knows where to find what you have, what you don't have. Most of you on this call probably don't have an ESG group or department. You might, and that's fantastic. But if you don't, designate a position or a person that when that person leaves, is a sustainability plan to really capture what you're doing. So this can also be in the form of a success list. And so that way, when you get those questionnaires I've mentioned, where someone wants to report on your agency, there's a person who knows where to find all of that material. If you want to go to the next slide, Eric. An easy way to do this is to share internally and externally. So mention marketing, make sure your social media people know about new endeavors you're taking on from an ESG standpoint so that they can share that and can get out to the public and to your internal stakeholders who are reviewing it.
Caitlin, I was going to say, Caitlin, as our resident millennial here on the call, can you tell us what, when we think about sharing externally, what sort of information is sort of a millennial employee looking for when they're or a millennial candidate looking for, and where would they be looking for it as they're researching a company? Oh, sorry, you're still on mute.
Sorry, guys. I think the biggest thing millennials utilize is Google. So make sure if you have this on your website, make sure you're using those keywords to attract millennials to actually check on your website. I do think one thing that millennials and Gen Zs are very aware of now is greenwashing. So make sure that if you're promoting what you're doing, you're actually doing it, and you actually have the data and the statistics and the research and the employees to help back you up on that.
Terrific. Let's do one last poll question so we can get our CLE credit here. Which component of social goals is highest on your list of pursuing at your company? Again, the voting button should be there at the bottom of your screen. We're giving you permission to rank these, even though maybe the good lawyerly answer is these are all equally important. But which of these do you feel like you're prioritizing from your perspective? Great. The DE&I. I think that's one that logically falls, within this S category. It's one that's been front of mind for so many businesses, particularly over the last several years, and one that's not going to go out of style. Continues to be one that I think to emphasize. But interestingly, some notes about worker safety, supply chain. So a lot of different areas where you can work here. Larissa, what can Husch Blackwell do to help the folks on the call today?
Yeah, well, we're happy to discuss developing goals as you're figuring out what works for your organization, creating these risk assessments, getting you resources on where to find implicit bias training to implement those goals. We want to help you provide samples so you don't have that time commitment that's such a challenge to so many people. So you're welcome to go to our ESG team website. You'll find all our information there, and looking forward to chatting more.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Larissa and Caitlin, for being my Sherpas in this area. It's been really interesting and exciting, and I think it's something that our firm has done a lot of work in, and an area we're excited to partner with our clients. And thank you all for joining us today. I have a final just a couple notes. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, please click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow morning, along with the recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. And then finally, we'd really appreciate it if you took the time to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This is the first in a series of presentations on ESG. You'll be hearing and receiving invites for follow-up presentations that are focusing on the E piece and the G piece, and then maybe how those things all fit together. So we really appreciated the time that you guys spent with us today and hope that you have a great rest of your day.